And now I can share my screen. All right, welcome everyone. Are you seeing the correct screen?
Yes.
Great, okay. Now let me get all my windows up on the back end actually. So welcome everyone, thanks for joining us today. Sorry, Zoom is being a little difficult. Today we're going to be introducing the Vermont Agriculture and Food System Strategic Plan for 2021 through 2030, which is a strategic plan that's been 18 months in development with over 1,500 Vermonters providing input in a variety of ways, including 149 contributors with deep expertise and knowledge about a particular product, market, or issue connected to our food system. My name is Sarah Danley. My pronouns are she, her. I'm with the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, which is the backbone organization for the Farm to Plate Network. I also do a lot of community, volunteer community organizing around the food system in my own community. Becca, would you like to introduce yourself?
I am Becca Warren. I also work with the Jobs Fund, specifically came aboard to work on the plan. And I know many of you also through my other job at Vital Communities. And
Great.
I also use she, her pronouns.
So during this webinar, we're going to talk about why Vermont has a plan, how the plan was created, and most importantly, how to use and understand the plan. Before we get started, if you can give yourself the right name, pronouns, and affiliation in your display name, and in the chat if you want to share what community or organization you're a part of, or instead just what interested you about today's webinar. This webinar is geared towards grassroots community groups themselves or the local or regional organizations that work with them, and is actually part of a series on using the plan. We've already done one on how to use the plan for grant applications, and you can stay tuned for future sessions on using the plan for policy advocacy and for research or education. We're going to take about 30 minutes with the slideshow. There will be a couple of breaks for questions as we go along. If you have questions before those breaks, please either enter them to the chat or just hold them until those breaks. I want to start us off with the land acknowledgement. Before I even share the land acknowledgement that's within the Farm to Plate plan, I wanted to take a moment to explain what a land acknowledgement is. So I'm going to quote from the Laurier Students Public Interest Research Group. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. It is also worth noting that acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. So this is the land acknowledgement that was developed as part of the Farm to Plate plan. We are on the land which has served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples for thousands of years and is the home of the Western Abenaki people. The Farm to Plate network honors, recognizes, and respects these peoples, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the land and waters. In that spirit, we acknowledge that we are guests in this land. We need to respect and help protect the lands within our use. Those who will implement the strategic plan have a responsibility to help make this truth visible, to support efforts towards Indigenous sovereignty and well-being, and to dismantle the legacies of colonialism here in Vermont. So our agenda for today, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a couple of breaks throughout. So we've divided the content into roughly 3 sections, each of them with their own Q&A break. First, we're going to be talking about what the plan is and how we created it. Then about what is actually in the plan, and then ideas for how you can use the plan to support your own work. And then we also don't anticipate that agenda to take the full hour, so we have some time at the end as well for some open conversation and idea sharing with each other. So first, why is the food system a focus for the state of Vermont? We're fortunate to live in a state where we prioritize our working landscape, make investments in our local rural communities, and know the importance of feeding one another. 10 years ago, the Vermont legislature created the Farm to Plate Investment Program. It's about actually 12 years ago now, which tasked the SJF with creating and implementing a statewide strategic food system plan. Over those past 10 years, we've gathered the Farm to Plate Network, which consists of over 300 organizations and businesses working together on key food system projects that no one organization can do alone. Over these past 10 years, over 6,500 net new jobs have been added within our food system, and the value of food produced in the state has grown from 9.8 billion per year to 11.3 billion. And Vermonters are spending more of their food dollars on locally produced products, growing from 114 million annually in 2010 to 310 million annually in 2017, or 13.9% of all food and beverage purchases. And I will note that it's over 10% even for food alone if you extract beverages, which, as we know, is largely due to the popularity of Vermont beer. While we have much to be proud of and grateful for when it comes to our food system in Vermont, we know we still have a lot of work that lies ahead of us in order to ensure that farm and food businesses are economically successful, food workers are well compensated, food production occurs in an environmentally sustainable manner, and that all Vermonters have access to healthy local food. We just released the new plan for the next 10 years, 2021 to 2030, and that's what we'll be walking through today. It's a roadmap for the decade that lies ahead. It provides the direction that we need now and as we recover from the pandemic and work together to seize the market opportunities before us. Most importantly, though, the plan is a plan of action for the entire state, and you're an important part of it, which is why we want to make sure you understand the content of the plan and how you can use it for your own work and in support of the amazing work that you're already doing. Becca, do you want to take us through the process?
I'm going to take you all just super briefly through the whole process of creating the plan. And we'll, as Sarah said, we'll go into some different details of it. But basically, the legislature, as Sarah mentioned, asked for this plan, a second strategic plan for the state, and is using it. It's their plan. So in 2019, that request for the new strategic plan was made, and they wanted us to achieve those three outcomes that just left the screen. So increasing sustainable economic development in Vermont's food and farm sector, improving the resiliency of the working landscape, and improving access to healthy local foods. So now you can go, Sarah, thank you. So the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets and the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund were tasked with leading the process. And the first part was the creation of food system position briefs, in which over 110 people in the state who were subject matter experts wrote short papers about the current state of the food system in Vermont. So, and then these briefs were the jumping off point for the plan itself. So the briefs were written, they each made 5 recommendations. Then we had producer focus group meetings for different producer associations, people who are involved in the different areas of the sector. And those folks set targets for growth and prioritized the recommendations that were made in the briefs. There was a statewide public survey. There were multiple conversations that were hosted through the network. And these all led to the contents of the plan, which are the vision, which paints the picture of where we want to be in 10 years that aligns with our values, our beliefs, and our priorities. The goals, to reach the vision, they articulate the results we want to achieve. They're how we are going to know that the vision has come to fruition. And then each goal has its own set of objectives, which is how we're going to measure and answer the question, how do we know if these goals have been accomplished? And then how we get to the vision is the priority strategies. These are based on recommendations from the product, market, and issue briefs and represent the high impact approaches we need to take to achieve our goals and objectives and make our vision a reality. So that's the picture of the plan itself, which you all might have seen. And then, okay, now we have our first stop for questions.
So now would be, if you have any questions on the process or the legislation underlying the plan or the process of creating it. And then we'll go more into detail on what those 3 elements that Becca just laid out are and consist of. And I can't see the chat, so Becca and Lydia, you'll have to.
Yep, no, we're good. No one has chatted a question yet.
Great. All right. So moving into part 2 of our content, which is more about what that content actually is within that plan. So again, we have the 3 legislative outcomes, the vision, which we're actually not going to talk about today, the goals, which we will talk about, and the priority strategies, which we will also talk about. So starting first with the goals to reach the vision. The 15 goals articulate the results that we want to achieve. They're the signposts for our vision coming to fruition. These 15 strategic goals were developed in service to the 3 legislative outcomes plus a commitment to racial equity. So as a result, these 15 goals are divided into 4 categories. The first 3 correspond with the 3 legislative outcomes, and the 4th is our commitment to racial equity. So the 4 categories then are sustainable economic development, environmental sustainability, healthy local food for all Vermonters, and racial equity. I am going to show us these all 15 goals. I won't read them all out loud, but I'll pause on each screen for a couple of seconds for you to read a few of them as examples. And I will also say that these are not in priority area, not in priority order. They're grouped by area, but the 15 are not priority order. So these are the 5 goals around sustainable economic development. Four goals around environmental sustainability. 5 goals around healthy local food for all Vermonters. And our racial equity goal. So each goal has objectives, which, Farm to Plate recognizes the importance of evaluation to see what progress we're actually making. So we developed a set of objectives for each of these 15 goals. Here's one of those goals as an example with all of its current objectives and one example of what a visual mock-up of those objectives could be. The objectives are the measurable improvements that will help us answer the question, how do you know if the goals have been accomplished? But they do not capture the whole story. We know that there are many aspects of the goals that are not quantifiable at all, or we simply don't have the data for yet. So it's a hopefully representative sample of different ways we need to change in order to meet that goal. So looking at this example to get a flavor of the objectives. With the first 3 on this slide, we have discrete targets, which were set by analyzing prior trends in combination with a healthy dash of optimism, but plausibility in terms of growth. So the 4th is an example of a type of objective that you might find in some of the other goals as well, in which it's simply stating that we want to see a measurable increase or decrease in case of negative issues. These are where we currently don't have a reliable baseline or established means of sourcing data, which made it difficult to confidently project a discrete numerical target that we're aiming for. Despite that, these are important indicators of progress, and the lack of data now is not going to discourage us from stating their importance and working to start tracking them over time. So going back to our framework again, that was the goals and objectives are sort of lumped together in this framework. And then after the goals and their objectives, we have the priority strategies on how to reach our goals. So there are 34 priority strategies. They are also not in priority order. These are the approaches, the programs, policies, and investments that will lead us to meeting our goals and objectives. The 34 priority strategies, as Becca mentioned, are derived from the product, market, and issue briefs and represent the high impact approaches we need to take in order to achieve our objectives and make our vision a reality. As you can see, and I realize that this text might be too small for you to read, so don't worry about that. But as you can see, each priority strategy is followed by a color-coded numerical icon, which indicates the goal and its outcome area that it addresses. And one of the things I personally find really striking about this plan is that most of our priority strategies work towards goals in several different outcome areas. So we had to group them by outcome area for the purposes of clarity in working towards our legislative outcomes, but we realized that they're all interrelated and most of our strategies work towards a number of different goals and even different legislative outcomes. So before we go into how these priority strategies were created, it's important to explain a little bit more about the 54 food system briefs, which we've mentioned briefly as the first stage of the whole process. So I'll hand over to Becca again to go over that.
Hello, it's me again. Okay, so there are 54 food system briefs that are part of the plan, and they cover important products, issues, and markets in the Vermont food system. So I'm going to hold up the plan. This is when we can show you actually how giant this thing is. Most of it is the briefs, and they're just really an incredible resource. So that most of this is briefs. The briefs were a way to assess the food system as we started the planning process, and each brief follows the same template and the same writing process. So each one was written by a subject matter expert who then consulted with additional experts to assess the current conditions, the bottlenecks, the opportunities on the product or issue or market channel they were tasked with. And that group of authors then determined the top 5 recommendations for advancing the product, the issue, or the market. So this example I'm just going to go through is the goat brief. I'm just going to show you what it looks like in the plan. There's many other product briefs as well. There's maple, there's grass-fed beef, there's dairy. So really a lot of different topics. So, but the goat brief, just to be give a more specific idea of how you could use this and what it looks like. So the lead author of the goat's brief is Eliza Leeper from Vermont Creamery. And the contributing authors were others in the industry, so people who raise goats for milk and for meat and make cheese, and people who represent industry groups of producers. So together, they identified what they agreed were the current conditions in the goat industry. In this case, they identified there was rapid growth in goat milk production and demand, but still that we had this goat cheese industry importing milk from out of state. So then they moved on into the bottlenecks and gaps section, where they noted that there's a lack of in-state resources on goat dairies and knowledge on goat dairies, and farmers might not know of this opportunity for growth because of this lack of resources. And then they dived into what the opportunities are, and one of our favorite ones, and the reason we choose this brief as an example, is that they believe that the existing goat cheese processor demand could support at least 10 new goat dairy farms of 400 or more goats each. So then they make 5 recommendations for how to improve and take advantage of some of the opportunities in the goat sector. So one of them is creating a center of excellence in goat dairy in the state, which would provide some of this expertise. Offer financial support to folks who want to transition to goat production. Add an extension position that focuses on goat farming. So those recommendations then lead us back to the strategies in the plan. Because as Sarah said, it's a lot of numbers, but there's 34 strategies. But the briefs as a whole made over 270 recommendations, right? So then how do we get down to just 35 priority strategies? So we took 2 approaches. So in some cases, there were multiple recommendations across briefs making the same word-for-word recommendations, showing that it was important to many areas of the food system and elevating it into a priority strategy. So here in this slide, you probably can't read, but one of the ones that was mentioned in many briefs was providing at least $1.5 million in annual funding to the Working Lands Enterprise Fund, which is a unique and critical source of capital that accelerates innovation. So that was clearly a priority strategy. It was mentioned in multiple briefs. Another approach we took is we saw that there were a lot of brief recommendations that were interrelated and thematically similar, and so we sort of condensed them into one priority recommendation, and we'll have an example of that tangibly in a little bit. But something like, I think the example that's going to come up in a couple slides is like a lot of industries were like, we need more infrastructure, we need processing facilities, we need storage. And so what we see multiple industries in the food system saying that they need that's clearly a priority strategy that we need to focus on. So about the briefs, just a couple final things to say is they themselves are just incredibly useful documents for understanding just a snapshot of a part of the food system, either that I might not know about, or that I find very complex, or that I've been like sending the meat processing brief to family members because people are always so curious about what are the concerns with meat processing. So they're very useful in that way. And also, I just want to make clear that because of this process we went through with the multiple authors on each brief, and then vetting them with producer groups, and then looking at strategies, we can understand that these have been vetted by industry members and experts in the field. And so these priority strategies can guide us to the goals that we have. So this is a quick overview of the briefs and how they relate to the strategies. And we're ready for any questions at this point just about the components of the plan themselves. Any burning questions or clarification?
I have a question. Um, did you find that there were any sort of conflicts of some of the goals going against the original three? I forget what you're calling them, the
The
legislative
legislative outcomes.
outcomes. Yeah, so some, just at a high level, I could see how some of them might be in conflict with each other, and I wonder how you kind of resolved that.
It's an interesting question, Lindsay. I don't remember an instance of that. Sarah, do you?
I don't. I'm curious, Lindsay, if you would be willing to share some of the examples that come to your mind of where there might be conflict.
The dairy, I saw that there was a mention about continuing to fund the dairy industry, and we've heard that that might not be, I don't know, the audit that went on recently, that might not be bringing that much value to the state, and then also the migrant justice issues, and how does that relate to the BIPOC racial equity initiative, as well as some of the environmental concerns.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. That's helpful to hear that example. I will say in terms of, like the work on the dairy industry is at the level of strategies, not at the level of goals. So I think part of the answer is that we don't feel like the goals are necessarily in conflict with each other, even if there are differences in which strategies should be prioritized or undertaken, if that makes sense. And I will also note that the original, so, I made reference to how our plan, we realized that all of the different buckets are not perfectly delineated, but the original legislation acknowledges that as well. In that the first goal, which we are loosely terming like the economic goal, even the original legislation refers to sustainable economic development too. So there is room within that legislation to really tease out these gray areas and make sure things are working with each other instead of in conflict. Becca, I don't know if you have anything to add, or Lindsay, if you have any thoughts on that.
No, thanks for answering the question.
Becca, do you have any thoughts? And I think I think that's a really interesting question, Lindsay, in terms of the strategies to pursue. And I think as I mentioned in the agenda, we're hopefully going to have some time at the end for group discussion. I think that'd be a really interesting question to hear from the whole group on, is how do we find those places and make sure there isn't conflict or working at cross purposes. I would love to revisit that with the whole group. Do we have any other questions in the chat or any other hands up? So moving to the last segment of our presentation on how to use the plan. What does this actually mean for you and your work in the food system? We realize that a lot of the work of the plan happens at the local level, not at the state level, not at the policy level, and we want to work with you on implementing this plan. First and foremost, I'd say we would love to hear from you if you work on food system issues and are not yet involved in the Farm to Plate network, to see if we can help you, to hear what you're working on, which will inform our work as well, and really even to hear from you how we can make the network work better for you if you're interested in becoming a part of it. We are also going to talk next about ways that you can use the plan specifically in the work that you're doing in your own communities or with the communities you work with. And we'll go into each of these in more detail, but the general categories are that you can use the information in the briefs to plan your work, to inform yourself and understand who you might be able to ask for more information. You can use it within your own strategic planning. You can use it in support of your fundraising, and you can use it in support of your policy advocacy. So before we go into more concrete details of those ways of using it, I did want to take a quick note about where and how to access it. So the plan is available at vtfarmtoplate.com/plan. You can either download it as the whole document that Becca was showing the printed version of, but you can also download it in pieces. So as you can see in the screenshot from the website, you can download it with just the first 32 pages that are the plan without all of the briefs. You can also download each of the briefs individually. And what we haven't shown in the screenshot, but we also curated a number of collections on interrelated briefs if you're interested in a specific topic and want to read the 5 briefs that are most closely related to that topic. So it's really sliced and diced in a lot of different ways to be as accessible as possible.
Yeah, so I'm just going to dive back into more encouraging you to use the food system briefs and the plan to plan your work and to inform your work. You can be confident that these briefs have been written and vetted by industry members. Every brief included producer advising. There were multiple producer, sessions where we had folks look at recommendations, vet them. Just the rich expertise within our state has been tapped to create the briefs and to create the plan. So you can be confident and think of this plan as a roadmap for the next 10 years, and have confidence in consulting it and referencing it. And this shot here is the farm food security and farm viability brief. So most of the briefs are just 2 pages. Some are 4, some are 6 or 8. This is a 4-page brief. So just if you are working or interested in food security and farm viability, there are 3 sections in this brief that go over the current conditions of the interrelationship between food security and farm viability in Vermont. It talks about economic issues, programs, gleaning efforts, and makes recommendations to advance these 2 issues simultaneously of food access and farm viability. So the brief can orient you to the priorities identified by the authors, as well as provide you with context for your work going forward. And then as it relates to the recommendations and the strategies, this in the back is the special table that looks very dry, but is very useful. So it's the point of connection that allows you to think about the briefs and the strategies from several different starting places. So let's say you're discussing a suggestion from a community member you're working with or a project that's being proposed. You can see where it fits in with the priority recommendations. The recommendations from the briefs are in this table are on the right, and then the priority strategies are on the left. So you can see how your recommendation from the brief that you're interested in fits into the priority strategies. Or perhaps you're really interested in wanting to know how to support something like agritourism. You can start with that brief and then, relate it to the priority strategies. And you can also say, okay, well, I see that there's this is the infrastructure priority strategy I mentioned. So you can say, I'm really interested in processing infrastructure, and I'm coming at it from a food grade grains passion. I really want to grind more wheat in the state, but I see here that this need has also been identified in restaurants and sheep and spirits and beer, and maybe I can build some relationships with these folks as well to get where I want to go with processing. So we're hoping this chart can help connect all of our work, and help us further collaborate. And then I just want to reemphasize what Sarah said earlier, which is the plan is a great source of qualitative and quantitative data. So at this point, we haven't collected a lot of original data, but we have compiled and crunched a lot of existing data to make it more accessible and more relevant. And there's data in the briefs. So this left one is from the agritourism brief. And then there are, as Sarah showed earlier, objectives in the plan that have data. And there will be more as we go along. So everything that's eventually listed as an objective in the plan will be tracked on the Farm to Plate website. And that's just a wonderful service in a way that the network provides and that the Jobs Fund backbone staff provide, is that we can rely on this data and we don't have to spend the time to go get it, because we can use it, as Sarah's going to lay out, for our purposes, and have data and feel confident that it comes from reliable sources and it's presented to us.
Thanks, Becca. So one of the next buckets of ways we can use the plan that we identified is to help use it as really as a tool for conversations for strategic planning within your community group. There are so many different entry points to food system work that often when a group of stakeholders comes together, they come with slightly different priorities or all the same priorities, but different emphasis or level of urgency on one of them. And sometimes it can be really hard to articulate those priorities, and a lot of assumptions can get made about where everyone's coming from or what they even mean by food systems work. So the plan can provide a framework for understanding what pieces of the food system are of most interest for your various stakeholders. For example, you could use the 15 goals to guide a dialogue. Ask all those who come to the table to work on food systems to articulate which of these resonate for them and which do not, which are the highest priorities, which ones do they think are most urgent for the community, etc. And to continue that example, if you use the goals as a tool to identify your shared priorities, sort of tracing that through the different sections of the plan in reverse order from what Becca laid out, you can identify that goal. Then you could look through the list of priority strategies with our little color-coded icons and find all of the strategies that work towards that goal. Then find that priority strategy in the table and see what briefs you might be interested in reading about to be more informed about the issue, and then pull up the information from that brief. So really, we encourage you to come at the plan in this sort of spectrum of different pieces that interrelate to each other. We encourage you to play around with coming up with the plan in whichever way makes sense for where you're at in your community conversation, and what your goals are for how to use the plan. The next way to use the plan is, if you already have a lot of great work going on, which many of you do, is you can use the plan in support of your own work. One of the really helpful ways to do that is use the plan in support of your grant applications. I'm just going to share 2 examples of how to do that. We did actually have a whole webinar on this subject, which I'll give you the link to in a second. But one example of how you can cite to the plan for background, and one example of how you can use the plan to apply for grants is in citing to the plan for background information. So this is a real example from a specialty crop block grant application where the applicant used the brief on hops to cite background information that supported their case for why they should get funding for their project. The other example I'll share with you today on how to use the plan in applications for grants is pointing out that your work is advancing the plan. So this is an example of existing group work that made the case that this project is an example of the farm to plate priority strategy number 9. Therefore, since we're saying this is a state priority, here's an opportunity to actually start implementing that priority with our project. Like I mentioned briefly, we did do a webinar on using the plan for grant applications. It was recorded and is available on our website. So it's at the vtfarmtoplate.com website in our resource collections called Putting the Plan to Use webinar series. That's where this recording will go as well, and the grant one is already up there. And I will note that the first half of that is a similar walkthrough of the process and content like we've been doing in this webinar. So you don't have to watch a whole nother hour. You can skip to the middle of that if you want more information on the specifics of using it for grant applications. Becca, you're on mute.
Even after all these years of being remote. Okay, so another way that folks are using the plan is in policy advocacy. So as we mentioned, the legislators asked for this plan. So they're aware of it. They've seen it, especially in the Ag Committee and some other committees. They have the plan, they're using the plan. So if you can articulate how your policy priorities relate to the plan, it allows the plan to do some of the heavy lifting for you in making the case that your policy is important for the state. And we've been very careful in presenting the plan to the legislature to frame it as their plan. So if you connect your policy with the plan, you can show that the legislature already supports this solution in their own vision. And this is some feedback that Faye Mack from Hunger Free Vermont gave us in terms of how she's been able to use the plan in advocacy that Hunger Free and Vermont Feed have been doing to advocate for farm fresh school meals for all, which does include 2 of the priority strategies named in the plan. So one is universal school meals for all Vermont students, and the other is a local food purchasing incentive grant program for schools. So Faye indicates, and indeed this has, I don't know if this has been signed by the governor yet, but it definitely has gone through both, through the legislature, that these ideas are priority strategies in the plan. And so the legislature could see that this was supported by a wide range of organizations, that these strategies would be strategic investments and that they would support the agricultural economy. So it's a great tool for showing how a single policy proposal fits into the bigger picture of moving Vermont's food system forward.
Finally, just want to revisit this idea of the Farm to Plate network. So as I mentioned before, the Farm to Plate network implements the plan. So the network is over 300 organizations and businesses, and people sign up for the network, self-select into the topic groups that they're most interested in working on, and then come together to learn from each other, collaborate, and work on these projects that are just not feasible for one organization to do alone. So we would really encourage you to join the network if you're not already a part of it. If you want to understand more about what that means, I'm happy to chat with you one-on-one about that. And yeah, so we encourage you to join the network. The screen shows a lot of the different values to that. But fundamentally, since this is your plan, feel free to use it in support of your own work. You don't need our permission, but also feel free to ask us what we think about your work and how it relates. And that's what we have for content. So we wanted to do one last question break and then move into sort of the more open discussion. So first, any questions about the content that's been presented?
So Janine is wondering about help for applying. Is there help available for filling out the Working Lands grant?
Mariah, did you have something to?
Hi folks, my name is Mariah Noth and I work with the Farm and Forest Viability Program at PHCB. There are kind of a few resources out there. There are private grant writing consultants that folks can work with, but also our program has a 2-year advising program that businesses can enroll in. And as part of technical assistance within that program, folks do receive help applying for a variety of grants. Working Lands grants are included in that. So Janine, I think you may have connected with our program before, but happy to chat more offline about what that can look like too.
Thanks, Mariah.
And not specific to Working Lands, but I don't know if I mentioned this in this presentation, but one of the main messages of the Applying for Grants webinar is that if you're interested in understanding how your proposal relates to the Farm to Plate plan, either in your own application answers or to do a letter of support, feel free to reach out to myself or Jay Clara, who's our program director, because we are more than happy to talk with you because we want to learn about your project and we're happy to help you articulate how it relates to the plan. Any other questions about the content? So hearing none, we do have some time left in this webinar, and we had planned for sort of an open discussion anyway for us to hear from each other on what you're working on in your community. And if you have any suggestions for how to use the plan or challenges you're facing. I do also want to lift up Lindsay's question from earlier again. It's a really important question. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about personally is that at the state level, it's really hard sometimes to work on things simultaneously. And it's really easy for things to potentially come in conflict with each other. One example, I work a lot with the food access section of the Farm to Plate network. So one of the things I think a lot about is increasing the viability of local production doesn't automatically inherently lead to increased food access for all Vermonters, but it can if we design the project properly. So that's one of the reasons I'm really passionate about using the plan to help communities do work in their own community and to design specific projects, because that project by project approach is where we really can make sure things support each other instead of coming into conflict with each other. So I would love to just hear from others your thoughts on the question Lindsay posed, but that's a piece of my answer is that, yes, I completely agree with you, Lindsay. It has to be like making sure they work together is at the community level and at the case by case level, which is why I'm really excited to be doing this webinar with you all.
have another question that came up, but the train was passing and I didn't want to take myself
Go
off of
for
you.
it.
Did the legislature appropriate any sort of funding to go in conjunction with these recommendations that could help some of these community groups help get this work done at the community level?
Not as part of the farm to plate legislation, but there are a number of efforts to set up funding streams that can help community groups do this work. But they was not a part of the actual farm to plate legislation, unfortunately. Anyone have any thoughts on the question Lindsay posed, or other thoughts in general to share?
This is Mariah, and I would just throw in on the note of it being a statewide plan. Even our organization, but as well as our partner organizations across the state, have found it just extremely useful, particularly in applying for like federal USDA grants, because it does cover the state and it allows programs that either act at whether it's a town or at a regional or at a statewide level, all to be able to utilize that and really make the case for what their project is. So just wanted to again commend all the folks involved, because this is a huge lift, and it's already proven very useful for a lot of our partners out there. So big thanks from VHCB.
Right.
Were there any questions you all had about the plan coming in that we didn't answer? Whether practical or existential?
I don't have another question, but I appreciate the suggestion to use the goals. I think we can do that at we're going to have an Acorn board retreat coming up in September, and I think it might be interesting for the board members to individually prioritize what they think, or the goals that they think should be prioritized, and we can go from there for the upcoming year. So that's a good suggestion.
We can also thank you and close the webinar early. We were thinking of this as a fun lunchtime activity, so we don't need to make sure to stay on until 1. So thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you all so much for attending, and we're looking forward to working with you, continuing to work with you all, and with those of you we haven't met.
And we will, once the recording is posted to the website, we will send it. I saw Lydia put the link in the chat where the grants one is already posted, but once this recording is up, we can send a link to that out to you all as well. And if you have others that you work with who might be interested, please feel free to forward this and share. We really want to help as many people around the state as possible at all geographic scales in continuing the good work that they're doing.
I just want to say one thing, and the help that I'm a producer, obviously, Cobb Hill cheese, and the help that we need is like helping us add a clean room, or like a we would like to be able to expand our vacuum sealing production, and so we have a room that we could finish off, and we actually would like to apply for grant money. We've tried in the past and we've been turned down. So that's the kind of help that for myself as a producer could use. I could use some help with finishing off that room, and then we could expand our vacuum sealing. That would help us be able to make more cheese and process more milk, so that we don't have to send it off to the commodity marketplace. So that's a good example. And I will be reading the plan and the briefs and the strategies, and I'll be in contact with someone. But that's like a practical example of what we need. So we need this little infrastructure project that we could get done. It would be super. For some reason, every time I fill out the paperwork with the working lands, it's I don't know if I'm just not doing it right, or I don't have enough matching funds. So in my case, we're asking for the grant. We don't have a lot of extra money to put in. So I think that's why I'm being turned down every single time, is because, we don't really have a lot of matching funds to offer. But that is just one example of what we could really use. And I'll go over everything, and I'll connect with someone, one or two people, and I'll see if there's any way that the strategic plan, it's definitely work. It's definitely helps to further the strategic plan along if we could get that help. Absolutely. So I will try again and see what happens.
Yeah, and I am not intimately familiar with working lands. I've never applied for it or been on the review committee. So I can't speak much to that grant specifically, but in terms of grant applications in general, feel free to reach out if you want help and identify. I mean, like the plan, we broke into all these pieces, but we know it's still a lot. So if you want help in pointing you towards things that might make the case to grant committees, we're happy to talk with you one-on-one. And then also just hearing feedback like that from you is a really important piece of the potential to do policy advocacy based on the plan. Like if we can say, or not even policy advocacy, just advocacy to organizations and grant makers and the legislature and advocacy in general. If we can say, we realize that this is an important piece of our plan, but we also are hearing that a bottleneck is something specific and fixable, for example, matching funds. That's another way that we can sort of, for the longer term, instead of a Band-Aid solution, for the longer term, start improving some of these systems to get producers the help that they need.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.